Patricia Brogan was 73 years old when she pulled into the driveway she had called home for nearly half a century. She turned off the engine, picked up her spare house key, and walked toward the front porch without the slightest idea that her life had already been packed away. She slipped the key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. She frowned. Tried again. Still nothing. Only then did she notice the faded brown suitcase sitting quietly beside the front door. No note, no phone call, no goodbye, just one suitcase. 47 years of marriage, reduced to whatever would fit inside it: her clothes, her late mother's Bible, a few family photographs, an old recipe box. Everything else left behind that locked door. Patricia never knocked. She never pleaded, because in that silent moment, she realized something far more painful than divorce. Her husband hadn't simply ended their marriage. He had already erased her place in the home they built together, long before the judge signed a single piece of paper. What Patricia couldn't possibly know was that the greatest thing he stole wasn't sitting inside that farmhouse. It was buried inside decades of forgotten county records, hidden beneath ordinary paperwork no one had questioned for years. Weeks later, a quiet stranger would place a thin folder into Patricia's trembling hands. Not proof, not justice, just one impossible question. Why did your name suddenly disappear? The answer would uncover a truth one man believed would stay buried forever. So before we open that first folder, take a second to subscribe. Because some stories don't just restore a home, they restore a life. And Patricia's journey is only beginning. The question stayed with Patricia Brogan as she stood on that porch. Why did your name suddenly disappear? She had no answer. Not yet. At that moment, she wasn't thinking about county records, forgotten paperwork, or buried truths. She was simply a 73-year-old woman staring at a locked front door that used to welcome her home every evening. The summer air in southern Iowa was warm, but Patricia couldn't feel it. She walked back toward her old sedan without looking over her shoulder. The faded brown suitcase felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was inside, because of everything that wasn't. She opened the driver's door, slid behind the steering wheel, and rested both hands there without starting the engine. The farmhouse sat quietly across the gravel driveway, white siding, green shutters, the porch swing Harold had promised to repaint every spring, a flower bed Patricia had planted with her own hands nearly 20 years earlier. Nothing about the house looked different, only the locks. Sometimes the smallest changes hurt the most. A pickup truck rolled slowly past the property. The driver glanced toward Patricia, recognized her, then looked away. Small towns had their own language. Nobody asked questions. Everybody noticed. Within hours, people across Millfield would know she had left. By sunset, they would all have their own version of why. Patricia closed her eyes. The courthouse that morning already felt strangely distant. The judge had spoken calmly. The attorneys had packed their briefcases. Harold had signed his papers without looking at her. 47 years together, reduced to signatures. She thought that would be the hardest part. She had been wrong. The locked door hurt far more than the divorce decree ever could. Because the new locks told a different story. Harold hadn't waited for permission. He'd planned this, long before either of them entered the courtroom. That realization settled over Patricia like a cold rain she couldn't escape. She stepped out once more. Not to argue, not to knock, just to pick up the suitcase. The leather handle creaked softly as she lifted it. She carried it back to the trunk of her car. Before placing it inside, she paused. 47 years. She whispered the number under her breath, not in anger, in disbelief. How did almost half a century fit inside one suitcase? She opened it. Neatly folded clothes, a navy sweater, 2 pairs of slacks, a winter coat she hadn't worn in years. Her mother's Bible rested carefully on top. The worn leather cover instantly softened her expression. Her mother had placed that Bible into Patricia's hands on the morning she married Harold. Marriage isn't built one day at a time, she'd said. It's built one ordinary choice at a time. Patricia gently brushed dust from the cover. She wasn't angry at her mother. She simply wished she could ask one more question. How do you rebuild after every ordinary choice suddenly disappears? Beneath the Bible sat several framed family photographs. One showed two much younger faces, smiling beside the freshly built red barn. Another captured Thanksgiving dinner with neighbors who had long since moved away. One photograph stopped Patricia completely. Harold, standing beside her. Both of them covered in mud after repairing a broken fence following spring floods. She remembered laughing until neither of them could breathe. She quietly placed the picture back inside. Memories didn't become lies just because people changed. At the bottom rested a faded wooden recipe box. Every holiday recipe she'd collected over decades lived inside it. Pumpkin pie, Sunday biscuits, peach cobbler, chicken and dumplings. Recipes carried by mothers, daughters, neighbors, and church potlucks. She smiled despite herself, not because she felt happy, because recipes couldn't be divorced. They belonged wherever she carried them. She closed the suitcase, lowered it gently into the trunk, then drove away. She never checked the rearview mirror. Some roads weren't meant to be watched after leaving them. The weekly motel sat beside Highway 34, just outside town. Clean enough, quiet enough, temporary. The woman behind the front desk greeted Patricia with the kind of smile reserved for people carrying more than luggage. Room 12 overlooked a faded parking lot and an aging soda machine that hummed through the evening. Patricia unlocked the door, set the suitcase on the bed, sat beside it for several long moments. The silence felt unfamiliar. For decades, evenings had followed the same rhythm: preparing supper, checking tomorrow's weather, folding laundry, writing grocery lists, listening to Harold complain about diesel prices or broken equipment. Now, nothing. Only the low buzz of an air conditioner struggling against July heat. She slowly unpacked. The sweater went into a drawer. The slacks followed. She placed her mother's Bible carefully on the bedside table. Then she opened the recipe box. The familiar recipe cards immediately made the motel room feel less lonely. She smiled at her mother's handwritten peach cobbler instructions. Then another card caught her attention. It wasn't a recipe. It was thicker, folded, yellow with age. Patricia frowned. She reached beneath the stack. Instead of another recipe, her fingers touched a small handwritten notebook. Old, worn. Its brown cover was scratched from years of use. She didn't recognize it immediately. She opened the first page. Numbers, field measurements, dates, short handwritten notes, nothing more. It looked like one of dozens of farm notebooks she'd handled over the years. She searched her memory. Had she packed it herself? She couldn't remember. Maybe it had slipped into the recipe box years ago. Maybe Harold had thrown it into the suitcase without noticing. It didn't seem important. Not tonight. She closed the notebook, slid it into the nightstand drawer, turned off the lamp. Outside, a freight train echoed across the Iowa fields. Patricia stared into the darkness. Tomorrow, she would start looking for work. Any work. She wasn't thinking about justice or revenge or the marriage she'd left behind. Right now, survival was enough. What she didn't know was that the forgotten notebook sleeping inside that motel drawer had already begun asking questions neither she nor Harold were prepared to answer. Morning arrived, long before Patricia felt ready for it. The motel curtains couldn't keep out the July sun. Golden light spilled across the room, landing on the small nightstand where her mother's Bible rested beside the unopened notebook. For a moment, Patricia looked toward the drawer. Then she quietly closed it again. There would be time for old papers later. Right now, she needed a paycheck. The divorce settlement covered very little. Her savings were modest. And at 73, retirement had suddenly become a luxury she could no longer afford. By 8 o'clock, she was driving through the center of Millfield with a handwritten list of businesses that might still hire someone her age. The diner already had enough staff. The grocery store wanted someone who could lift heavy deliveries. The feed supply warehouse politely told her the work was too physical. 3 interviews, 3 gentle rejections. No one was cruel. That almost made it harder. People smiled kindly, apologized sincerely, then chose someone younger. Patricia never argued. She thanked each manager before walking back to her car. She understood business. She had spent most of her life making practical decisions herself. Still, every "we're looking for someone else" landed a little heavier than the one before. Just after lunch, she noticed a handwritten sign taped inside the window of the Millfield County Historical Society. Part-time archive assistant needed. No experience required. Attention to detail preferred. Patricia almost smiled. Attention to detail. That, at least, was something she still had. The building had once served as the town's first courthouse. Its hardwood floors creaked beneath every step. Old photographs covered the walls. Glass display cases held farming tools, newspaper clippings, school trophies, and faded family Bibles donated by local residents. The place smelled faintly of old paper, cedar shelves, and coffee that had been sitting too long. A cheerful woman named Donna greeted Patricia from behind a wooden desk. Within 20 minutes, they were talking less about qualifications and more about patience. Donna explained that donations arrived every week. Boxes filled with journals, letters, farm ledgers, church records, family photographs. Someone had to organize them before they could be cataloged. "It isn't exciting work," Donna admitted with a laugh. Patricia looked around the quiet room. "I think exciting has been a little overrated lately." Donna smiled. "You start Monday." The work suited Patricia almost immediately. There was something comforting about putting forgotten things back where they belonged. One morning she organized handwritten family histories. The next day she sorted black and white photographs from farms that no longer existed. Every box carried another family's memories, another piece of Iowa quietly refusing to disappear. As the days passed, Patricia developed a rhythm: white cotton gloves, soft brush, catalog number, storage sleeve, shelf, repeat. She rarely thought about the farmhouse anymore. Her mind stayed focused on the task in front of her. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. Donna wheeled in 3 dusty archive boxes labeled County Conservation Files, 1980s. Patricia froze. Not because she recognized the boxes, because she recognized the forms inside them: inspection checklists, soil conservation reports, waterway maintenance schedules, compliance summaries. The paperwork looked almost identical to documents she had completed hundreds of times during her years on the farm. She carefully lifted one folder from the box. The handwriting belonged to someone else. The formatting didn't. She knew those layouts. She had helped create filing systems almost exactly like them decades earlier. Without realizing it, Patricia began comparing dates, initials, signatures, and margin notes the way an experienced farmer automatically notices weather changing across a field. Old habits never completely disappear. That evening, curiosity followed her back to the motel. After supper, she finally opened the nightstand drawer. The forgotten notebook waited exactly where she'd left it. She carried it to the small table beside the window. This time, she looked more carefully. Every page was filled with neat handwriting. Her handwriting: field numbers, acreage calculations, inspection dates, fence maintenance, creek restoration, tree planting schedules, drainage observations, annual deadlines. She turned another page, and another. The memories didn't arrive all at once. They returned quietly. Late nights at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside stacks of paperwork, double-checking measurements before mailing reports, calling county offices when deadlines changed. Reviewing inspection notes while Harold slept in his recliner after supper, Patricia stopped turning pages. She hadn't just helped around the farm, she had managed responsibilities no one ever talked about, responsibilities that kept everything moving. She looked closer. Every notebook entry followed the same careful routine. Until suddenly, they didn't. One year ended. Another should have begun. Instead, blank pages. She frowned. That wasn't like her. She had documented everything, always. She searched the remaining pages. The notebook continued, but the subjects changed. Simple reminders, shopping notes, garden measurements. Nothing about conservation reports anymore. Patricia leaned back in her chair. Something wasn't right. She closed her eyes, trying to remember. Why had she stopped? Retirement couldn't explain it. The entries ended years before that. She whispered the dates aloud. Then another memory surfaced. Not a complete memory. Only a single conversation. Harold, standing near the kitchen doorway, telling her he would handle the government paperwork from then on. She couldn't remember his exact words, only the feeling. Relief. At the time, she had believed he was trying to lighten her workload. Now, she wasn't so sure. Patricia opened the notebook again. She compared the final conservation entry with the date she vaguely remembered Harold taking over. They matched. Exactly. A chill moved through the quiet motel room. Coincidence? Maybe. But it didn't feel like one. She carefully closed the notebook, not because she had found answers, because she suddenly realized she had discovered her first real question. The next morning, across the street from the Historical Society, a retired county volunteer paused over an old property index. His eyes stopped on one familiar name, Patricia Brogan. Then, a few pages later, it was gone. The next morning, Patricia couldn't stop thinking about the notebook, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it didn't. Questions had a way of following her now. She tucked the notebook into her canvas tote before leaving the motel, not to study it, just to keep it close. Somehow it no longer felt like an old farm record. It felt unfinished. The walk from the parking lot to the Millfield County Historical Society was short. Across the street stood another brick building she had barely noticed before, the County Records Center. For years, she had driven past it without giving it a second glance. Now, she found herself looking toward its front doors a little longer than usual. She couldn't explain why. Inside the Historical Society, the morning settled into its familiar rhythm. Donna was answering phones. A volunteer carefully dusted framed military photographs. The old clock above the reception desk ticked steadily through the quiet building. Patricia slipped on her white cotton gloves and returned to cataloging donated family journals. It should have been an ordinary day. Instead, someone was walking toward the building carrying a slim gray folder. The man appeared to be in his late 70s. He moved slowly but with purpose. His silver hair was neatly combed beneath a faded county surveyor's cap that looked older than some of the records inside the building. When he stepped through the front door, Donna looked up and smiled. "Morning, Leon." His voice was calm, friendly, the kind of voice that never needed to compete for attention. Donna nodded toward Patricia. "She's our newest helper." Leon smiled politely before looking directly at Patricia. "Mrs. Brogan?" Patricia lowered the photograph she had been cataloging. "Yes, I'm Leon Kincaid." He extended his hand. His grip was gentle. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "Not at all." He hesitated for just a moment. "I was hoping I could borrow a few minutes." Donna quietly returned to her desk, sensing the conversation wasn't about museum records. Leon glanced toward a reading table near the window. Patricia followed him. Neither of them spoke until they sat down. Leon carefully placed the gray folder between them. "I volunteer across the street," he began. "The county's digitizing decades of agricultural records before the paper copies become too fragile." Patricia nodded politely. She still wasn't sure why he was telling her this. Leon rested one hand on the folder. "I wasn't looking for your family. I wasn't investigating anyone. In fact, I've never met your former husband." That caught Patricia's attention. Former husband. News traveled fast in Millfield. Leon continued. "A few days ago, I was comparing historical filing indexes, just routine work, making sure old property records matched newer digital entries." He paused. "That's when I noticed your name." Patricia felt her shoulders straighten. "My name." Leon opened the folder. Inside were several photocopied index sheets. Nothing dramatic, no highlighted pages, no alarming notes, just neat columns of names, dates, reference numbers, government file codes. He slid the first page toward her. "There." Patricia looked down. "Brogan, Patricia A." Her name appeared beside several conservation project files, inspection reports, land management records, drainage improvements. She turned another page. There it was again. Another page. Again. Another. Again. She frowned. "I remember some of these." Leon quietly nodded. "So did I." He turned several more pages, then stopped. Patricia searched the page. Her name wasn't there. She flipped to the next one. Nothing. Another. Still nothing. Yet the Brogan farm continued appearing throughout the records. Conservation projects continued. Inspection schedules continued. Government certifications continued. Only one thing had changed. Her name had vanished. Patricia looked back at the earlier pages, then at the later ones. She searched carefully, believing she had overlooked something. She hadn't. The change was absolute. 1 year she existed, the next she didn't. Silence settled between them. Finally, Patricia spoke. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," Leon answered honestly. "And that's exactly why I came." He leaned back in his chair. "I've worked with county mapping records most of my career. I've seen filing mistakes. I've seen missing pages. I've seen records damaged by floods and fires. But this," he gently tapped the folder, "this doesn't behave like a filing mistake." Patricia looked at him. "What does it behave like?" Leon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he chose his words carefully. "It behaves like someone changed one story, without realizing there were dozens of other stories connected to it." Patricia felt the room grow strangely quiet. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past the front windows. Inside, the old wall clock continued ticking. Leon pushed the folder toward her. "I made these copies for you. I wasn't sure whether I should, but if someone handed me proof that something about my own history didn't make sense, I'd want to know." Patricia slowly gathered the pages. "What do you think happened?" Leon gave a small shake of his head. "I don't know, and I won't pretend I do. The answers aren't inside this folder. They're somewhere else." He looked toward the courthouse square outside the window. "These are only filing indexes. They tell you where records should exist. They don't tell you why they changed." Patricia lowered her eyes to the pages again. "So where do I look?" Leon smiled kindly. "The records no one has compared." Then he stood. His visit had lasted barely 15 minutes. Before leaving, he paused beside the table. "Mrs. Brogan, sometimes the smallest inconsistency uncovers the biggest truth. And sometimes it uncovers nothing at all. You deserve to know which one this is." He tipped his cap, then quietly walked back across the street. Patricia remained seated long after he disappeared from view. The folder lay open before her. Her notebook suddenly made more sense, not because it answered Leon's discovery, but because it belonged to the same missing years. For the first time since leaving the farmhouse, Patricia understood something important. This wasn't about remembering the past anymore. It was about proving it. Late that afternoon, after the Historical Society closed, she placed Leon's folder beside the notebook inside her tote bag. Then she drove to the motel with a decision she never imagined making. Tomorrow, she wasn't going to search for another job. She was going to search for an attorney. The next morning, Patricia parked outside a one-story brick office a few blocks from the county courthouse. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking at the simple brass plaque beside the entrance. Elaine Foster, attorney at Law Agricultural Property, Estate Matters, Land Disputes. Patricia wasn't there to start a fight. She wasn't looking for revenge. If someone had asked her only a month earlier whether she would ever hire an attorney, she would have laughed at the idea. But this no longer felt like a divorce. It felt like a question that refused to leave her alone. She picked up Leon's folder, then the old notebook, took a slow breath, and walked inside. Elaine Foster looked to be in her early 60s. She listened more than she spoke. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She simply let Patricia tell the story from the beginning. Not every detail of the marriage, only the parts that suddenly seemed connected. The notebook, the disappearing records, the filing indexes Leon had copied. When Patricia finished, the office fell quiet. Elaine didn't reach for a lawsuit. She didn't promise a courtroom victory. Instead, she folded her hands. "I think we're asking the wrong question." Patricia looked up. "I thought the question was, who removed my name?" Elaine gave a slight shake of her head. "Eventually, yes. But first we need to answer something much simpler. What actually happened?" The distinction surprised Patricia. Elaine continued. "If we begin by accusing someone, we'll spend our time defending assumptions. If we begin by gathering facts, the facts will tell us where to go." It was the kind of practical answer Patricia had always respected. For the first time in weeks, she felt as though someone was standing beside her, instead of telling her to move on. The investigation began quietly. No dramatic courtroom filings, no accusations, no newspaper headlines. Just records, boxes, dates, and patience. Elaine submitted requests for county archives, historical conservation files, property records, annual certification documents, inspection reports, tax records connected to the farm. Some documents arrived within days, others took weeks. Patricia continued working at the Historical Society while the requests slowly made their way through government offices. Life settled into an unusual rhythm. Morning at the archives, afternoon at work, evening reviewing copies with Elaine. The pile of documents on Elaine's conference table grew a little higher each week. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A property survey, a drainage permit, a routine inspection, exactly what they expected to find. Then the gaps began to appear. One certification referenced an inspection report. The inspection report wasn't there. Another file listed supporting maintenance records. Those records couldn't be located. Several annual reviews referred to earlier documents that seemed to have vanished completely. Not destroyed, simply missing. Elaine never jumped to conclusions. She placed each document into neat stacks, one labeled confirmed, another labeled referenced, a third labeled unavailable. The last stack slowly became the tallest. Patricia watched it grow with quiet concern. "I don't understand," she said one evening. "If records disappear over time, wouldn't it happen randomly?" Elaine nodded. "Usually." She slid another document across the table. "This one references 3 supporting files. They're gone." She picked up another. "This one references 2. Gone." Then another. "This one references 4. Also gone." She looked directly at Patricia. Random loss doesn't usually follow patterns. Patricia stared at the papers. Patterns. That word again. Leon had used it. Now Elaine was saying the same thing. Not because they knew each other, because the records kept leading them there. Several days later, another packet arrived from the State Conservation Office. Inside was an annual certification. Elaine scanned the first page, stopped, read it again, then quietly handed it to Patricia. Near the bottom appeared a familiar line. Farm Conservation Manager, Patricia A. Brogan. Patricia blinked. The date? She checked it twice. It was several years after Harold had told her he would handle all government paperwork himself. "That can't be right," she whispered. "I wasn't filling these out anymore." "So why were you still listed?" Elaine asked calmly. Patricia had no answer. Only another question, one that felt heavier than the last. If official records still recognized her role, who had decided she no longer existed elsewhere? Over the following weeks, Elaine covered an entire wall of her office with a growing timeline. Colored notes marked every confirmed document. Blue for conservation work, green for inspections, yellow for property filings, red for missing records. At first, the wall looked chaotic. Then, a shape began to emerge. Patricia stood quietly, studying decades of her life laid out across the board. There were years she had barely remembered. Projects she'd forgotten, inspections she had prepared, deadlines she had met, thousands of ordinary responsibilities. She hadn't simply helped on the farm, she had helped keep it qualified, helped keep it organized, helped keep it trusted. For nearly half a century, no one had ever framed her work that way before. Not even Patricia herself. Elaine stepped beside the timeline. Without saying a word, she placed a thin ruler against one section. The red markers became impossible to ignore. Almost every missing document, every unexplained gap, every broken reference, clustered within the same stretch of years. The exact years Harold had insisted on taking complete control of the paperwork. Neither woman spoke. The silence carried its own weight. Finally, Patricia asked the question both of them had been avoiding. "Is this enough?" Elaine looked back at the wall. "No," she answered gently. "It's enough to concern me, but concern isn't evidence." She folded her arms. "Paper tells us what was recorded. It rarely tells us what happened inside a room." Patricia followed her gaze toward the timeline. "So how do we fill in the missing years?" Elaine's expression softened. "We stop asking the records," she turned toward Patricia. "We start asking the people who were there." Patricia looked once more at the long line of colored notes stretching across the wall. Somewhere beyond those missing files, someone still remembered what the paperwork no longer could. When Elaine called the next morning, her voice carried a quiet sense of purpose. "I think we've reached the point where paper can't do any more." Patricia stood beside the motel window, watching early sunlight spread across the nearly empty parking lot. "So what comes next?" "We find the people." Over the years, farms changed hands, businesses closed, government offices reorganized, employees retired. But people carried memories that never fit inside filing cabinets. Elaine had spent enough years handling agricultural cases to know something important. Records could disappear, a person's memory could fade, but when several unrelated people remembered the same thing, it became much harder to dismiss. Within a week, they had assembled a short list of names: retired inspectors, former extension agents, accountants, field representatives, men and women whose careers had crossed paths with the Brogan farm decades earlier. Some had moved to neighboring towns, others were enjoying retirement only a few miles away. Patricia felt strangely nervous before the first meeting. Not because she feared what they might say, because she feared they might not remember her at all. Their first visit took them to a modest ranch-style home outside Millfield. A retired conservation officer named Walter Briggs greeted them from a shaded front porch. Time had slowed his steps, but not his memory. After a few moments of conversation, Walter smiled warmly. "Patricia Brogan. I haven't heard that name in years." He leaned back in his chair. "You always had the paperwork ready before I even parked my truck." Patricia couldn't help smiling. "I tried." "Tried?" Walter laughed softly. "You made my job easy." He looked toward Elaine. "Most farms needed follow-up visits, not theirs." Patricia always knew what inspection was coming. If we needed measurements, they were already waiting. If we needed maintenance records, they were organized. If something needed fixing, it was usually fixed before we arrived. Patricia lowered her eyes. No one had spoken about her work that way before, not in years. Walter wasn't trying to encourage her, he was simply remembering, and somehow that mattered even more. Their next stop brought them to a retired county extension agent named Linda Carson. Boxes of gardening books filled her sunroom. The moment Patricia introduced herself, Linda's face brightened. "Oh, I remember you. You carried those enormous binders everywhere." Patricia laughed quietly. "I suppose I did." "You absolutely did." Linda held her hands nearly a foot apart. "Bigger than anyone else's. I used to joke that if the courthouse burned down, your binder could probably replace half the county's records." The women shared a genuine laugh. Then Linda became thoughtful. "You always knew every deadline, every conservation update, every inspection requirement. You were one of the most organized people I worked with." Elaine listened without interrupting. She wasn't collecting compliments. She was establishing consistency. Different people, different careers, different memories. Yet everyone described Patricia the same way. Prepared, reliable, meticulous. The pattern continued. A retired accountant welcomed them into a small office behind his home. Stacks of old tax ledgers still covered the shelves. Before Patricia could finish introducing herself, he chuckled. "You never lost a receipt." She smiled. "I probably lost a few." "Not that I ever saw." He shook his head. "I used to tell younger farmers they should organize records the way you did. If someone needed an invoice from 7 years earlier, you could find it before I finished asking." He leaned forward. "You kept that farm running. Not Harold, not the machinery, not luck. You." The room fell quiet. Patricia swallowed carefully. For weeks, the divorce had left her wondering whether she had exaggerated her own importance, whether she had simply been helping around the edges, while Harold managed the real work. Now, without realizing it, 3 different professionals had described the same woman, not invisible, essential. Something inside Patricia began to settle. The marriage had ended, but the truth hadn't. Late one afternoon, Elaine received a return call from a retired USDA field representative named Richard Ellison. He agreed to meet them at a small cafe near the state line. Richard arrived carrying nothing except a weathered notebook of his own. After exchanging introductions, Elaine explained why they had come. Richard listened quietly, then rested both hands around his coffee cup. "I remember one meeting." Patricia looked at him. "Only one? One that always seemed ordinary." He searched his memory. It would have been, maybe 20 years ago. There was a discussion about future correspondence. Patricia frowned. She couldn't place it. Richard continued. Harold told us all future paperwork should go directly to him. He said you were stepping away from handling administrative work. Patricia's eyebrows lifted. Stepping away? Richard nodded slowly. That's what I remember. No one questioned it. It wasn't unusual. People divide responsibilities all the time. He looked genuinely troubled. If someone says their spouse wants fewer responsibilities, we accept it. Patricia searched her memory. She remembered Harold gradually taking over mail. She remembered him saying it would save her time. But stepping away completely, she had never described it that way. Not to anyone. Richard sighed. I wish I could remember more. Elaine asked one careful question. Did anything change after that meeting? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened his notebook. Its pages were filled with old appointments and handwritten reminders. He slowly turned several pages, then stopped. His finger rested on a single entry. There. He read silently for several seconds, then looked up. I knew something felt familiar. What is it? Elaine asked. Richard's expression changed. After that meeting, I signed documentation confirming updated conservation contacts. Patricia leaned forward. You signed it? I'm almost certain. Elaine's voice remained calm. Would copies still exist? Richard looked uncertain. They should. He paused. Unless. The sentence drifted away. Unless what? Richard closed the notebook. I've searched county archives before. Sometimes local copies disappear, but federal reporting requirements were different. He looked directly at Patricia. If that paperwork was forwarded the way it should have been, there may be another copy. Silence settled over the table. Elaine and Patricia exchanged a glance, not because they had found proof, because they had found something better, a direction. As they walked back to the parking lot, Patricia looked toward the fading evening sky. Only a few weeks earlier, she had believed the divorce had erased everything she had spent a lifetime building. Now, person after person remembered exactly who she had been. The records might have forgotten her, the people never had. Elaine unlocked her car but didn't get inside. She looked back at Patricia. I think we've been searching in the wrong place. Patricia tightened her grip on the folder Leon had first handed her. If county records aren't the whole story. Elaine nodded. Then it's time to find the records the county never controlled. Somewhere beyond Millfield, inside state offices, or perhaps inside a federal archive, where old histories were much harder to erase. A missing file might still be waiting for someone to ask for it by name. The following Monday, Patricia found herself standing in front of a building she had never expected to enter. It wasn't another county office. It wasn't the courthouse. This building belonged to the Regional Conservation Archives, where decades of agricultural records had been stored long before computers replaced rows of filing cabinets. Elaine looked toward the entrance. If we're right, she paused, this is where the missing years stop hiding. Patricia tightened her grip on the leather tote hanging from her shoulder. For weeks, every answer had led to another question. Today, for the first time, she felt as though they might finally be walking toward something solid. The archive looked nothing like the busy government offices Patricia remembered. The lobby was quiet. Rows of compact shelving stretched beyond secured doors. Old microfilm cabinets lined one wall. Climate-controlled storage rooms protected records dating back generations. Nothing about the place felt hurried. History had learned patience. A record supervisor named Nancy Ellis welcomed them into a small research room. She had spent nearly 30 years managing agricultural archives before retiring, but now volunteered a few days each month, helping researchers locate historical material. Elaine explained what they were searching for: county conservation records, federal program filings, archived certifications, anything connected to the Brogan farm. Nancy listened carefully, then smiled. If you're only searching county copies, you're limiting yourselves. Patricia looked up. What do you mean? Nancy opened a binder showing how conservation reporting had worked before digital databases. One project rarely stayed in one office. Local agencies submitted reports. The state reviewed them. Federal programs often received copies. Sometimes, universities conducting conservation studies requested summaries. She gently closed the binder. People think one file exists. In reality, there were often several. Patricia felt a quiet surge of hope. If one record disappeared, perhaps another hadn't. The search stretched across several days. Boxes arrived one after another. Microfilm reels clicked steadily through old viewing machines. Digital backups recovered records scanned years before paper files had begun deteriorating. Nothing happened quickly. Some days they uncovered only a single useful page. Other days, entire folders appeared. Each discovery felt small by itself, yet together, something remarkable began happening. The missing years were slowly rebuilding themselves. Elaine never celebrated individual documents. Instead, she spread every new record across the long conference table inside her office. By the end of the second week, the polished wood had almost disappeared beneath paper. Inspection schedules, handwritten conservation logs, annual compliance certifications, government correspondence, cost-share approvals, soil management plans, aerial photographs showing drainage improvements across different decades, colored tabs marked dates, colored string connected related files. Patricia stood silently beside the table. She wasn't looking at paperwork anymore. She was looking at her own life. One page reminded her of the creek restoration project completed after heavy spring flooding. Another documented tree planting along the northern property line. A third confirmed conservation inspections she had nearly forgotten preparing. Ordinary days, recorded forever. Not because anyone expected them to become important, because someone had simply done the work. Late one afternoon, Elaine stopped rearranging documents. She stepped backward, folded her arms, and studied the entire table. There it is. Patricia looked up. What? Elaine pointed toward several documents connected by colored notes. Watch what happens. She lifted one county filing. Your name disappears here. She immediately picked up a state certification, completed the same year. There you are again. Next came a federal cost-share approval. Again, Patricia's name appeared. Then an inspection summary. Again, another compliance review. Again. Elaine slowly worked her way through nearly a decade of records. Every time Patricia vanished from one agency's paperwork, she resurfaced somewhere else, sometimes weeks later, sometimes months later, but always somewhere. Elaine gently laid the final document back onto the table. No one erased you. Patricia frowned. I don't understand. Elaine looked directly at her. They couldn't. She rested one hand on the growing timeline. These agencies shared information. Not perfectly, but often enough. If someone wanted to remove every trace of your work, they would have needed to change dozens of connected records. She shook her head. That never happened. Instead, only certain documents had changed, the ones closest to home, the ones most easily controlled. Silence filled the office. Patricia slowly walked around the conference table. Every document represented another season, another inspection, another responsibility she had quietly accepted without asking for recognition. She reached toward one handwritten conservation log. Her own handwriting stared back at her. Steady, careful, precise. She suddenly understood something that caught her completely off guard. The process hadn't begun after retirement. It hadn't begun during the divorce. It had begun years earlier. Little by little, responsibility by responsibility, signature by signature. She remembered Harold saying he would handle more paperwork. She remembered believing he was trying to help. Now, looking at nearly 3 decades spread across one room, those memories felt different. Not false, just incomplete. The divorce hadn't erased her. It had simply exposed an erasure already underway. Patricia lowered herself into a chair, not because she felt defeated, because the truth carried its own weight. Elaine quietly placed one final sheet onto the table. Unlike the others, it wasn't an inspection or a certification. It was a copy of the property documents submitted during the divorce proceedings. She compared them against the timeline. Then her expression changed. She read the pages again, more slowly this time. Finally, she looked at Patricia. I think we just found something even more important. Patricia felt her heartbeat quicken. What is it? Elaine turned the document toward her. When the court divided the marital property, These were the supporting records submitted. Patricia scanned the pages without immediately understanding. Then she noticed what wasn't there. No conservation management history, no long-term compliance documentation, no decades of operational records connecting her to the farm's government programs, nothing showing the role she had carried for years. Elaine spoke quietly. The court wasn't given the complete historical record. Patricia looked back at the wall-sized timeline stretching across the office. So the judge never saw any of this? Elaine slowly shook her head. No. The decision was made without knowing the full history. Neither woman spoke for several moments. Outside the office window, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Inside, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The investigation had crossed an invisible line. This was no longer about missing files. It was about missing history, and history, when enough pieces survived, had a remarkable way of putting itself back together. As Patricia carefully gathered the documents, Elaine's phone vibrated across the conference table. A message had just arrived from someone inside the county clerk's office. Elaine read it once, then a second time. Her expression grew serious. Patricia didn't ask what it said. She already knew. Somewhere, someone had just realized the past was no longer staying buried, and Harold Brogan had finally begun to notice. By the time August arrived, Patricia noticed something had changed, not inside Elaine's office, not inside the Historical Society, inside the farming community itself. Conversations became quieter whenever conservation programs were mentioned. County employees who normally exchanged quick greetings suddenly seemed more careful with their words. No one stopped Patricia on the sidewalk. No one asked what she was doing, but people were paying attention. News rarely traveled through newspapers in Millfield. It traveled across feed stores, church parking lots, coffee counters, and pickup trucks parked beside grain elevators. Somewhere along the way, people had learned that old conservation records were being reviewed. No one knew exactly why, only that someone was asking questions about the Brogan farm. Harold Brogan treated the rumors as though they were nothing. Whenever neighbors mentioned Patricia's name, he gave the same calm answer: "She's having a hard time accepting the divorce." Then he would shrug. "It'll pass." Most people nodded politely. It sounded believable. After all, divorces often left hurt feelings behind. Why would this one be any different? But those closest to Harold noticed something else. He had begun visiting his office more often. Boxes appeared in the back of his pickup. Phone calls grew longer, and for the first time in years, he canceled 2 fishing trips with friends, saying he was too busy catching up on paperwork. No one questioned him, yet the confidence he displayed in public never quite reached his eyes. A few days later, Harold sat across from his attorney in a quiet conference room. The file between them was much thicker than it had been during the divorce. His attorney removed his glasses and spoke carefully. "I need you to understand something." Harold leaned back. "This is still about Patricia refusing to let go." The attorney slowly shook his head. "No. It stopped being only about the divorce." He tapped the growing stack of documents. "This is about historical documentation." Harold frowned. "So what? So, if records continue contradicting one another, people are obligated to ask why." Harold crossed his arms. "Are they accusing me of something?" "No. And that's exactly why you should take this seriously." The attorney paused before continuing. "No one has made allegations. They're simply comparing records. And sometimes," he looked directly at Harold, "the records tell their own story." For the first time during the meeting, Harold said nothing. Meanwhile, Patricia continued living one ordinary day at a time. She still worked part-time at the Historical Society. She still returned each evening to the modest motel room that had slowly begun feeling less temporary. But something inside her had changed. She no longer woke each morning wondering whether she had imagined her own importance. The timeline, the witnesses, the recovered records, they had given her something the divorce had almost taken forever: confidence. Not pride, not bitterness, simply confidence. She knew what she had done. She no longer needed someone else to tell her. One Thursday afternoon, her phone rang while she was organizing donated family photographs. She glanced at the unfamiliar number before answering. Hello? A long silence followed. Then, Patricia. She recognized Harold's voice immediately. It sounded older than she remembered, not weaker, just tired. She waited. I heard you've been digging through old records. His words were measured, careful. Patricia answered honestly. I'm trying to understand them. Another pause. Finally, Harold sighed. Some things don't need to be reopened. She looked through the window toward the courthouse square. The younger Patricia would have apologized by now. She would have tried to calm the conversation. She would have worried about making him uncomfortable. That woman was gone. I think they do. Her voice remained gentle, steady. Harold spoke again. You're only going to make this harder. For both of us. Patricia closed her eyes for a brief moment. I didn't start looking because I wanted another fight. I started looking because too many things stopped making sense. Neither spoke. The silence stretched between them like an old country road. Then Harold quietly said, You should let the past stay where it is. Patricia answered without hesitation. I tried. She ended the call. There was no anger, no raised voices, no dramatic farewell. Just one simple decision. For the first time in nearly 50 years, she had refused to abandon something simply because Harold wanted her to. As summer slowly gave way to early autumn, something unexpected happened. People began contacting Elaine instead of waiting to be found. One retired drainage inspector remembered Patricia walking every section of the creek before inspections. A former equipment contractor recalled Patricia coordinating conservation work while Harold handled machinery. A neighboring farmer remembered seeing Patricia meeting with government representatives long after Harold later claimed she had stepped away. None of them arrived with accusations. None claimed to know what had happened inside the Brogan marriage. They only described what they had personally witnessed. Nothing more, nothing less. Elaine appreciated that. Facts carried farther than opinions. Every interview ended the same way. Another date added to the timeline. Another memory matched against existing records. Another piece quietly fitting into place. The picture continued growing clearer. Then, late one afternoon, Elaine received a call she had been hoping for. The former regional conservation coordinator had finally located archived approval records stored in an off-site records facility. The copies arrived 2 days later. Patricia sat across the conference table as Elaine carefully opened the package. Several approval forms appeared, routine paperwork at first glance. Then Elaine stopped. She read one page, turned to another, then looked toward Patricia. Come here. Patricia walked around the table. Elaine pointed near the bottom of the document. There, beneath a conservation improvement approval, was Patricia's signature, another file, another signature, then another. The dates caught Patricia's attention immediately. These projects had continued well beyond the years when her name had disappeared from local county paperwork. She looked at Elaine in disbelief. How is that possible? Elaine gently laid the papers side by side. Because these approvals were processed through a regional office, they weren't relying solely on local filing records. Patricia traced one signature with her fingertip. She remembered signing it. She remembered reviewing the project. She remembered believing everything had been properly recorded. Somewhere along the line, only part of the story had been rewritten. The rest had remained exactly where it had always been. Safe inside records Harold had never controlled. Elaine slowly gathered every recovered document into one organized stack. The timeline that had once been filled with unanswered questions now looked very different. Not complete, but connected. Every new witness, every recovered record, every surviving signature, all pointing in the same direction. She looked across the table at Patricia. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Then Elaine broke the silence. I think we're finished asking what happened. Patricia searched her face. What do you mean? Elaine rested one hand on the thick stack of files. I think every clue we've uncovered is finally pointing toward one complete explanation. And for the first time since that faded brown suitcase was left on the porch, Patricia realized the hardest truth might not be discovering what Harold had done. It might be understanding how long he had been doing it. By early September, Elaine's conference room no longer looked like a lawyer's office. It looked like the story of one woman's life. The wall-sized timeline remained covered with colored notes, The conference table was filled with carefully labeled binders. Every recovered record now rested exactly where it belonged. Weeks earlier, each document had raised another question. Now, those questions were beginning to answer one another, not through a single dramatic discovery, but because every small piece finally fit inside the same picture. Patricia stood quietly beside the table. She no longer felt overwhelmed by the paperwork. She recognized it. Every page represented another ordinary day she had never expected anyone else to remember. Elaine slowly removed the colored strings connecting the documents. "They've served their purpose," she said. Patricia looked surprised. "What changed?" Elaine smiled gently. "We're not trying to find the story anymore. We've found it." For nearly 2 hours, they worked through the timeline from beginning to end, not searching, confirming. The old handwritten notebook from the recipe box came first. Once it had seemed like nothing more than forgotten farm notes. Now it became the foundation. Its inspection schedules matched archived conservation reports. The acreage calculations matched government survey records. The maintenance dates aligned perfectly with field inspections recovered from state archives. Nothing inside the notebook stood alone anymore. Every entry connected to something outside it. Patricia watched quietly. She had spent weeks wondering whether the notebook mattered. Now she understood why it had felt important the moment she opened it. It had never been a diary. It had been a working record, one piece of a much larger system. Next came the filing indexes Leon Kincaid had quietly placed in her hands. At the time, they had raised only one troubling question: why had her name disappeared? Now, they answered something much larger. Her name hadn't disappeared because her work had ended. It disappeared while the work continued. That distinction changed everything. Elaine laid several documents beside one another: county filings, state certifications, regional approvals, federal conservation summaries. Each came from a different office. Each had been created for a different purpose. Yet together, they described exactly the same farm, exactly the same projects, exactly the same years. Only one detail kept changing: whether Patricia received official credit. Witness statements came next. Walter Briggs remembered inspections. Linda Carson remembered binders filled with records. The retired accountant remembered Patricia locating financial documents faster than anyone else. Richard Ellison remembered Harold requesting future correspondence be directed only to him. Individually, each memory had been meaningful. Together, they became something stronger: independent confirmation. Different people, different professions, different decades. Yet every one of them described Patricia performing the same responsibilities. Not occasionally, consistently. Elaine carefully placed each interview summary beside the documents supporting it. The timeline no longer relied on memory alone, or paperwork alone. Each strengthened the other. Finally, Elaine reached the last section of the table. "This," she said quietly, "is where everything comes together." She spread several federal program files across the polished wood: cost share approvals, land stewardship reimbursements, conservation incentive summaries, environmental improvement funding. Patricia looked from one page to another. At first, they appeared ordinary. Elaine pointed toward the approval history. These programs weren't automatic. She traced one line with her finger. They depended on documented conservation work. Then another, and another. Each approval referenced completed projects, inspection compliance, land improvement standards, management responsibilities. Every year the farm remained qualified. It continued receiving valuable financial benefits tied directly to conservation performance. Patricia slowly looked up. "So, my work helped keep those programs active?" Elaine nodded. "For years." She reached for another binder. "The evidence is overwhelming. You weren't simply helping around the farm." She paused. "You were the documented conservation manager." The words settled quietly across the room. Patricia lowered her eyes. She had never called herself that. Not once. She had always answered with the same simple sentence: "I help my husband." Now, 30 years of records were saying something entirely different. She hadn't been standing beside the operation. She had been helping hold it together. Elaine turned toward one final folder. Unlike the others, it came from the divorce proceedings. She opened Harold's financial disclosures. Patricia had seen portions of them before, never this closely. Elaine placed the disclosure beside the reconstructed timeline. "Read this sentence." Patricia leaned forward. Harold's filing described her farm involvement during the years leading to retirement as minimal. The single word seemed almost unbelievable now. Elaine didn't comment. Instead, she quietly slid another document beside it, then another. Inspection schedules, certification approvals, management correspondence, government acknowledgments. Projects Patricia had designed years earlier continued benefiting the farm long after Harold began submitting paperwork under his own name. The land still relied upon systems she had planned. The programs still rewarded work she had documented. The improvements continued generating value. Only one thing had changed. The records closest to home gradually stopped acknowledging who had built that foundation. Patricia read the word again. Minimal. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because after everything she had learned, the word no longer had the power to define her. The evidence did. 2 days later, Elaine received a call from Harold's attorney. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. When she hung up, Patricia searched her face. "They want mediation." Patricia remained silent. Elaine continued. "They're requesting it before this expands any further." "Further?" Elaine nodded. If agencies begin conducting their own administrative reviews, the process becomes much larger than the divorce. Patricia understood. This was no longer only about property, or money, or even the marriage itself. It had become about an official history that no longer matched the records surrounding it. The truth had grown too large to ignore, not because of one dramatic piece of evidence, but because every ordinary piece agreed with every other. There was nowhere left for the inconsistencies to hide. That evening, Patricia returned to the motel one last time before mediation. She opened the faded brown suitcase that had once represented everything Harold believed belonged to her. The clothes were neatly folded. Her mother's Bible rested exactly where she had placed it weeks earlier. The old recipe box remained beside it. She gently lifted the notebook from its protective sleeve. It no longer looked forgotten, it looked respected. Carefully, she placed the notebook inside a single blue folder containing the timeline Elaine had rebuilt. Nothing extra, nothing unnecessary, only the documents that told the truth. She closed the folder, then closed the suitcase. The woman who had arrived at that motel had believed she was carrying the last pieces of her old life. Tomorrow, she would walk into mediation carrying something entirely different. Not memories, not accusations, just one folder. And for the first time in many years, every page inside it finally told her story. The mediation began on a cool September morning. There were no television cameras, no crowded courtroom, no rows of spectators waiting for someone to lose. Just 2 conference rooms, a long table, several folders, and decades of history waiting to be acknowledged. Patricia arrived carrying only the blue folder Elaine had helped assemble. It fit easily beneath one arm. Strange, she thought. 47 years had somehow become light enough to carry in one hand. Elaine noticed her looking at the folder. "You all right?" Patricia nodded. "I finally am." Harold entered through a different hallway a few minutes later. For the first time since the divorce, Patricia saw him without anger clouding her thoughts. He looked older. His shoulders seemed lower. The confidence he had, carried through the courthouse months earlier, had faded into something quieter. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to argue about. The facts had already done the talking. The mediator began with a simple reminder. This process isn't about assigning blame. It's about reaching a fair resolution. Patricia appreciated those words. She hadn't come hoping to embarrass Harold. She hadn't spent months rebuilding forgotten history just to watch someone else suffer. She had come because the truth mattered. Everything else would follow from that. The morning unfolded one document at a time. Elaine presented the reconstructed timeline, not dramatically, patiently. The handwritten conservation notebook, the archived certifications, the inspection schedules, the state records, the federal program approvals, the witness statements. Each page quietly confirmed the next. Nothing needed exaggeration, nothing needed emotion. The evidence spoke in its own steady voice. Several times the mediator stopped, only to ask for clarification. Each answer pointed back to another document already waiting in the folder. Piece after piece, the picture remained exactly the same. Not because someone insisted it was true, because independent records kept agreeing with one another. Shortly before lunch, Harold's attorney requested a private meeting. The mediator agreed. Harold disappeared into another room with his legal team. The door remained closed for nearly 40 minutes. Patricia never asked what was being discussed. She simply waited. When they returned, Harold's expression had changed. His attorney spoke quietly, almost respectfully. He acknowledged that the historical documentation created serious complications that reached far beyond the divorce itself. If the dispute continued, years of additional litigation could follow. Administrative agencies might begin their own reviews. More records would be examined. More questions would be asked. No one in the room wanted that, especially when the evidence already established a clear historical record. The conversation shifted, not toward victory, toward resolution. By late afternoon, the framework of an agreement had taken shape. The first provision mattered more to Patricia than she expected. The historical record would formally recognize her decades of documented management contributions connected to the farm's conservation work. She read the sentence twice. Recognition, one word. Yet it quietly restored something the divorce had almost erased. The remaining provisions followed, a substantial six-figure financial settlement, her rightful share of unpaid conservation incentives connected to the documented projects she had managed, corrected conservation agreements, ensuring future annual payments reflected her verified contributions. Each term grew naturally from the records Elaine had reconstructed. Nothing felt invented, nothing felt excessive. The settlement wasn't rewarding Patricia for winning. It was correcting what should have been acknowledged years earlier. Financing the agreement required difficult decisions. The acreage Harold had fought so fiercely to keep could no longer remain untouched. Part of the farmland would have to be sold. The irony settled silently across the room. For years, he had worked to separate Patricia from the land. In the end, that same land secured her future. Patricia took no satisfaction in it. She had spent nearly half her life caring for those fields. Watching them leave the family wasn't something she celebrated. Some victories carried their own sadness. Near the end of the mediation, the mediator asked one final question. There is one remaining issue. Everyone looked toward him. The farmhouse. He turned toward Patricia. If ownership becomes available through this agreement, would you like the opportunity to reclaim it? The room grew still. Elaine didn't speak. Harold looked down at the table. Patricia thought about the white siding, the green shutters, the porch swing, the flower beds she had planted years earlier. She remembered the locked front door, the faded brown suitcase waiting outside. Then, she smiled. It wasn't a smile filled with triumph. It was quieter than that. No. The single word surprised everyone except Patricia herself. She folded her hands calmly. Some homes can't be rebuilt by walking back through the same front door. Silence lingered. No one challenged her answer, because somehow, everyone understood. The farmhouse belonged to another chapter of her life. She didn't need it anymore. When the paperwork was finally signed, the sun was beginning to sink behind the courthouse. Patricia stepped outside, carrying the same blue folder she had brought that morning. Only now, it felt different, not heavier, lighter, for the first time since leaving the farm. She wasn't carrying unanswered questions, she was carrying a future. As she reached her car, Elaine joined her. So what comes next? Patricia looked across the quiet streets of Millfield. I don't know exactly. She smiled thoughtfully. But I know it won't be behind me. A week later, while driving through the countryside without any particular destination, a weathered mailbox caught her attention. Beyond it sat a modest farmhouse surrounded by open fields. Beside the house, an aging red barn leaned gently with time. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't grand, but something about it refused to give up. Patricia pulled onto the gravel drive and turned off the engine. For several quiet moments, she simply looked at the old barn standing against the autumn sky. Some places, just like some people, didn't need to be perfect. They only needed one more chance. Winter arrived quietly. The fields beyond Millfield rested beneath a pale morning frost. For the first time in many years, Patricia Brogan woke without wondering what she had lost. Instead, she thought about what she was building. A few months after the mediation, she found exactly what she had been looking for. Not a grand estate, not another sprawling farm, just a modest white farmhouse surrounded by 20 peaceful acres in the neighboring county. The front porch overlooked open pasture, an old maple tree shaded the yard, and standing a short walk behind the house was the weathered red barn she had first noticed from the road. It leaned a little. Its paint had faded. Its doors groaned when they opened. But Patricia smiled the moment she stepped inside. Unlike her former home, this place demanded nothing from her except that she enjoy it. The first document she signed wasn't for a government program or a conservation agreement. It simply transferred ownership into her name. When the closing agent asked what she intended to call the property, Patricia answered without hesitation, Brogan House. Not after the marriage that had ended, but after the woman who had survived it. The barn slowly came back to life. Local carpenters repaired the roof. Neighbors volunteered to repaint the weathered siding. Retired farmers donated folding tables. Church members brought bookshelves. Someone delivered old wooden chairs that only needed sanding. No one asked Patricia to repay the kindness. They simply wanted to help. By early spring, the barn no longer stored hay. It welcomed people. On the first Saturday of every month, women from across neighboring counties gathered inside. Some were recently widowed. Some were approaching retirement. Others simply wanted to understand paperwork they had always trusted someone else to handle. Patricia never stood behind a podium. She never called herself an expert. She simply pulled up a chair beside everyone else. Every workshop began exactly the same way. I trusted someone else to understand the paperwork because I believed love made questions unnecessary. The room always became still, not because the sentence sounded dramatic, but because so many women quietly understood it. Together, they talked about property ownership, estate planning, financial records, retirement protection, conservation agreements, and something even more valuable, the confidence to ask questions without feeling guilty for asking them. Patricia wasn't teaching people to distrust those they loved. She was teaching them that trust and understanding should always walk together. One warm afternoon, another familiar face stepped through the barn doors. Leon Kincaid. He quietly joined the back row and listened throughout the workshop. When everyone else had gone home, Patricia walked over to thank him. Leon smiled. "I don't think you needed much help from me." Patricia shook her head. "I didn't thank you for changing my life." She paused. "I thanked you because you handed me the first clue." The courage came later. Leon nodded gently. Sometimes, that was enough. As he prepared to leave, something near the entrance caught his attention. A simple glass display case stood beside the door. Inside rested the faded brown suitcase, the same one that had waited on the farmhouse porch months earlier. A small brass plaque beneath it read, "This suitcase once carried everything I had left. Now it reminds me that no one can pack away your worth." Leon stood quietly for a long moment before smiling to himself. Some objects carried memories, others carried lessons. That old suitcase had somehow learned to carry both. As evening settled across the countryside, the last visitors waved goodbye and drove home. Patricia switched off the lights one room at a time. The restored barn grew peaceful again. She stepped outside onto the porch and looked across the fields glowing beneath the setting sun. The air was still. The future felt still too, not empty, peaceful. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small ring of keys, then turned back toward the barn. For just a second, she rested one hand on the weathered wooden door before locking it. The latch clicked softly. Months earlier, someone else had changed the locks on her life. Tonight, she was the one holding the keys. Not because she owned more land, not because she had won a settlement, but because she finally owned something no one could ever sign away again, her future. If Patricia's journey touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring comeback stories that remind us it's never too late to reclaim your dignity. And now, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think was the most powerful moment in Patricia's journey? The locked door, the forgotten notebook, or the suitcase that became a symbol of her worth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story or perspective may encourage someone else who needs it today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.